Well, it's good to see the boys back in town. Hello everyone, it's Jim Lynn here. Welcome to episode 23 of Mr. Lynn's Workshop. This is part 2 of our series where we super tune the Lie-Nielsen No. 4 smoothing plane. Now there's going to be a part 3 now, and that's simply because there was so much to get through that I ended up with a video that was over 40 minutes long, so I thought it made sense to split that up. Now the good news is that means part 3 is already made, so you won't have to wait long. I'll be posting that soon. Now in part 2 we'll be mostly cleaning and polishing all the components of the No. 4, but first of all let's deal with an issue I discovered with the depth of cut adjuster yoke. Have a look at this. You can see some deep score lines at the working end of the yoke here. It's more prominent on this side. Well, that area is supposed to be smooth. So what's caused this? Well, the yoke works by poking through the blade and bearing on the lower edges of a slot in the chip breaker. Now I don't know how Lie-Nielsen machined these slots, but these edges are really sharp. You can see here there's no light reflecting off that edge, which is a good indication of sharpness. So the harder metal of the chip breaker seems to be cutting into the less hard metal of the yoke. To fix this we need to get the yoke out of the frog, so here I'm using a 3mm drill bit as a drift to push out the pin. This is a coarse grade dia sharp mini hone, and I'll use that until all the deep scoring has disappeared. Well, that didn't take very long. Now I'm just going to work up the grades using the red medium file and then the green fine file, and finally finishing off with some 2500 grit wet and dry paper. So I did this process on both sides of the tip of the yoke and then finished up by just dressing the edges with the fine file, and the result is a really nice smooth yoke. It's going to work a lot better than it did. Next I'm going to turn my attention to the ends of the arms of the yoke, and I'm just going to give them a polish. These contact the inner surfaces of the adjuster knob, so it makes sense that they're nice and polished as well. Now you might think, won't this increase the backlash? Well, I think I'm literally removing just a few atoms, so I don't think that's going to be a problem. I finished up work on the yoke by cleaning the rough cast surfaces. I'm using a wire brush here, and I think that works really well. Some Skeleton Saws peacock wax for protection, and that's the yoke finished. Let's turn our attention now to the root cause of the scoring on the tip of that yoke. It's these sharp edges on the underside of the chip breaker. I'm using the mini hones again, using the blue coarse file first, then the red medium, then the green fine. This is the result we're looking for. That bright reflected light tells me that those edges are now blunt, and that should eliminate the scoring. So the next task on the list is to clean and polish a lot of these small parts. Now as far as holding the parts go while you're polishing them, you can just hold them in your hand, or you can put them in a pin vise, or you can hold them against one of these mechanical polishing mop machines, something like that. But what I like to do is use an electric drill like this and just chuck them up in there. Now I find good control over that. You can keep the speed quite low. It doesn't produce a lot of dust, so you don't need the dust extraction. But one or two parts need some help to hold them in that drill, and this is one of them, the depth adjuster knob. It needs some kind of a mandrel in there to hold it in the drill. So there's a couple of options for that, so let's have a look at that next. This idea is just a piece of threaded rod and some nuts and washers. I thought that was too many parts, so the more obvious solution is to swap out that threaded rod for a bolt. The only trouble was that the head of this bolt is a bit too wide and sharp, so I filed it down to make a much smaller pan head style. Now this will definitely work very well, but there's an even better way, and that is to take out the adjuster knob screw from the frog and use that. Now it might seem a bit drastic to do this, but it's actually quite straightforward. The most important thing is to protect the thread, and I like to use a piece of copper wire for that because it's softer than the bronze that the thread is made of. So here I'm just trapping the copper wire so that I can wind it round. A little curl of copper wire protects the body of the frog whilst I set the hold down clamp that secures the whole assembly. Now I can just wind the wire round the screw. Here I'm snipping the two ends of the wire just to release the whole assembly for turning. Now I can clamp on the grippers knowing that the thread is protected. The little black mark is just a telltale to let me know that the screw is actually turning. It's slow progress, but take your time. Make sure that every time you reposition the grippers you tighten them up. That will ensure that the copper doesn't slip or the grippers contact the thread. You can see the copper itself gets quite chewed up, but at least this means that the thread isn't chewed up. Here I've protected the thread with some gaffer tape and screwed on the adjustment knob, then dropped in a washer for further protection and chucked it up in the drill. So the intention was that the gaffer tape would be sufficient protection against the jaws of the chuck of the drill marring the threads, and I proceeded to carry on and use that method and did all the parts, but towards the end on closer inspection I realised that in fact it wasn't enough protection. Have a look at this. Those little dimples you can see on the peaks of the thread are caused by the jaws of the drill chuck crushing through the gaffer tape. So we just need some better protection, so I found some plastic tube and cut off a length and we'll see if that works. However, once bitten, twice shy and all that, so I thought I'd better do a test. I found this screw from an old Stanley plane and I put on the piece of tubing and then chucked it up in the drill and really crushed it down as hard as I could. There's no evidence of any dimples there, so good, let's move on. The dimples on the threads have some burrs which gives a slightly rough feeling when you turn the adjuster knob. So my method of fixing that involves first of all blunting the blade of this Stanley knife, which means when I wrap this piece of 1500 grit wet and dry paper around the blade, it isn't going to cut through it. Owing to the thin blade, I can get the paper down into the threads and apply pressure on the side walls, and this removes the burr. Now you can see that the dimples are still there. However, when I turn the adjustment knob on the screw, it feels much smoother. There's no hint of any roughness, so I'm sure that the burrs have now gone. So I've got the drill clamped in such a way that it doesn't rock whilst in use, and the third clamp to keep the trigger depressed. With the adjuster knob screwed onto the mandrel and the drill turning in such a way that it keeps it tight on that mandrel, I can start the polishing process. Here I'm starting with 1500 grit paper. If you've got a long fingernail you can get right into the corners. If you don't, you can just use some kind of a tool. Here I'm working on the vertical face of this inside channel, and this is important to get this polished because that's where the yoke contacts the adjustment knob. I've changed up to 2500 grit paper now, and I'm also using this tool with the paper wrapped round the end. This helps me apply better pressure in the areas that are difficult to access with just the fingers alone. The final step in the process is to apply some of Shane Skelton's peacock wax. Just apply it with a soft cloth and then buff it over with a cleaner part of the same cloth. Unscrew the adjuster knob, turn it round and then polish the other face. And of course don't forget the wax. Now the next step, with the drill stationary, is to use a wire brush to clean out the grooves of the knurling. Now be very gentle with your wire brush, it's the very tips of the bristles that do the cutting, so don't scrub away and bend them, you'll just ruin the brush. A light touch with a wire brush is a great way of cleaning out threads. In the insert you can see the alternate method using the knife with the paper wrapped round it. Sometimes you need to do a bit of touching up with the drill stationary. Now in this scene you can see that I'm using the gaffer tape to protect the threads. At this point I hadn't discovered the dimples yet. So we'll just carry on using the same technique for all the rest of the parts. Here I've got a credit card sized diamond plate to apply pressure on the inside vertical faces of this groove. Notice I'm using a brush with steel bristles to clean the thread in this steel part. To clean the screwdriver slots of some of these parts, I use the rounded corner of the credit card sized diamond plate to apply pressure to the abrasive paper. Don't forget to take the time to smooth over any sharp edges or corners. This partially threaded rod comes from the inside of the handle, and the combination of that and the brass knob is what holds the handle onto the body of the plane. I'm just using it here as a mandrel to hold the brass knob whilst I polish it. Here I'm using the brass wire brush to clean the threads of the front tote securing screw. Right, let's turn our attention to this little guy. This is part of the frog adjuster mechanism, and it just needs a polish and the edges cleaning up. Here I've got some 180 grit wet and dry paper spray mounted to my reference surface, and I'm using the mag lock to hold the part. Now the depression on the underside of the mag lock, fortunately, is half as deep as the part is thick, which means the part protrudes just enough to give adequate clearance as I pull it across the wet and dry paper. The coarse paper makes short work of this task. I just keep going until I've got an even pattern of scratches on both sides of the part. Then it's just a case of working through the grits, so 360 grit next, and then 800 grit, then 1500 grit, and finally this 2500 grit, which gives a reasonably good polish. I cleaned up all the edges and corners in the usual way using the diamond files, but to get into this inside curve I used this engineer's deburring tool. And that's all the fixtures and fittings cleaned and polished. So let's turn our attention towards the body of the plane. Now the rough cast sections, we're never going to be able to keep these from picking up dirt or tarnishing, but we can at least clean them so we've got a good starting point. Here I'm just using the brass wire brush, 4.5 strokes, and eventually I can do circular strokes to get in all the nooks and crannies. I can't really get into every single corner with this brush, it's just too bulky, but we can do our best. Same work with the frog and the rough cast sections. I found I couldn't really get the brush into these internal sections, so I just did the best I could, but I could do some good work on these external sections. The last thing to do is to apply some of Shane's peacock wax. Now this is good stuff. At the very least it takes off the muck and detritus you can see there left behind by the brushing, and it gets into the pores, into the nooks and crannies, and it helps to stop tarnishing, and it will certainly help to stop muck collecting in the future. making good progress. Before we move on to the next step, let me show you something about the relationship between this frog and this blade. Have a look at this. In front of a light source, I've propped up the frog and laid the blade on it. There's no tension, there's no lever cap, there's no chip breaker, and you can see there's a tiny gap of light. And I measured that, it's in the order of a thousandth of an inch or 25 microns. Next, I assembled the blade and the chip breaker and secured them to the frog with the lever cap so that now the whole assembly is under tension. So now if we look at the gap with everything under tension, we can see that it's increased quite a bit. In fact, it's gone up to 7 thousandths of an inch, which is about 180 microns, so that's 7 times larger. So what's the significance of this? Well, clearly it doesn't affect the operation of the plane, but because the blade contacts the frog in this area and in this area, this means that those areas are where we should concentrate most of our polishing work. I've got the blade out again and I've reattached the mag locks in positions that allow me to apply pressure towards the front of the blade and about a third of the way back towards the rear of the blade. Now this will mean that those parts are the only bits that are getting a good polish, and the reflections show that I pretty much achieved that. I wasn't really that happy with the finish on the upper surface of the chip breaker, so I decided to do it again. Notice here that the chip breaker isn't actually flat, it has a slight spring to it. With the mag locks attached, I can get a good grip and easily vary the pressure from front to back. There's a transition point between the flat upper surface of a chip breaker and the bevel, and the lever cap gets quite close to that. So I thought I'll just round over and polish that while I'm here. That's a much more even scratch pattern than I had before. When it came time to change paper to the next grit size up, I thought to myself, this is a bit wasteful, isn't it? Using one sheet of paper for each operation. Then I thought, why am I even using the granite reference block? It's not as if the chip breaker needs to be kept dead nuts flat, it just needs to be polished. So I got out my die chem mat. This is the mat that I use to hold my sharpening stones to the bench, and I found that it grips this chip breaker like a limpet. So now I'm able to use smaller bits of paper and work my way up the grits quite easily. This is a much better system. Once I'd finished up with the 2500 grit paper, I cleaned all the metal dust off the die chem mat using multi-solve. This will ensure that there's no metal dust around to contaminate the next step, which is to use the autosol. Now you've seen this before. Apply it liberally, polish hard until you can see the shine coming through, and then buff it up with a clean part of the same cloth. And the final step for the time being is to apply some peacock wax. Whilst you can still see the grain in the metal, this is a good polish. The last step with the chip breaker is to sharpen it, and the first step in that process is to regrind the primary bevel. Now why would you bother doing that? Well, although the manufacturer supplies your blade or your chip breaker pre-ground at 25 degrees, the system they use to set 25 degrees may be slightly different to the system that you're going to use. And although it's only a fraction of a degree difference, you will notice that when you come to regrind for the first time. Although it's not so important with chip breakers, with blades it is, particularly if you're going to put a curved edge on your blade for the first time. Then I reset the blade to 30 degrees and did some work at that angle for a while. The reason is I found a couple of nicks in the edge and I thought it'd be quicker at 30 degrees. In hindsight, it wasn't really. I should have probably used 45 degrees, and this would have had the added advantage of giving me a stronger edge. So to summarise, the process for preparing the primary bevel of the chip breaker is to grind on the 140 grit diamond stone at 25 degrees, and then continue that process on the 1000 grit stone and the 10,000 grit stone. And then because I had some nicks at 30 degrees, I used the 1000 grit stone and then the 10,000 grit stone. This setup, with the top surface of the wooden block positioned slightly below the top surface of a 10,000 grit stone, ensures that we're going to polish only the very tip of that edge. Here I'm just making sure there's no wire edge left. So the result is a good level of polish on the upper side and a tiny sliver of polish right at the very tip of the underside. Well, good progress so far. In part 3, we'll begin with blade preparation and we'll finish up this project by taking some test cuts. So until then, thank you very much for watching everyone, and I'll see you next time on Mr. Lynn's Workshop.